Hello again. Okay, today we're going to start a new system. We're going to start the respiratory system. So we're going to talk about the lungs and how air gets in and how you breathe and a lot of details about that. So why do you think we have a respiratory system? What's the main function of the respiratory system? Anybody got an idea? So we can do what? Exchange gases. This is how we're going to get oxygen into our bodies. We're going to move carbon dioxide from our bodies, so we're going to use gas exchange. And we've talked about moving oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs and in the tissues when we talked about blood flow. So now we're going to talk a little more detail about how that actually occurs in the lungs. And so when you think about respiration, so that's the act of gas exchange. So respiration is gas exchange. So respiring and moving the oxygen and carbon dioxide across the lung membranes. It actually requires two systems, the respiratory and the circulatory. Okay, and that makes sense because when you're breathing in the oxygen, it's got to go to your blood. Okay, when you're breathing out the carbon dioxide, it's got to come from the blood to the lungs so you can breathe it out. So it's really two systems working together. There's actually four processes that supply the body with oxygen and dispose of CO2. So I'm going to show you all the different parts of respiration. Just to make sure we know where we are, we're going to do more detail on the anatomy in just a minute, but we're talking about the nose, the mouth. We're talking about basically the way the air can get in, because most of the time you breathe through your nose, but we can be mouth breathers, so that includes the mouth too. And then air can go down to the trachea and then out to the lungs. Okay, and we're thinking about the lungs. We talked about blood flow and capillaries. So there are capillaries in the lungs where you're going to be able to bring oxygen from the air. So oxygen from the air into the blood, and then CO2 from the blood to the air. Okay, so let's move forward here, and this just kind of shows you in detail the movement of those gases at the capillaries. Okay, all right, so what is respiration? It really involves, again, those two systems, and there's four different kind of divisions, if you want to think of it that way, when you talk about respiration or gas exchange. There's the pulmonary ventilation. Okay, so this is what we call breathing. So respiration and breathing aren't really the same thing. This is when you're moving air in and out of the lungs. All right, so that's your respiratory system. Okay, that's what it's doing, and it's actually moving the air in and out. Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, then you have what's called external respiration. This is the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the lungs and the blood. Okay, so this is bringing oxygen into the lungs, blowing out CO2, and it's connected to the outside, so external respiration. Then you have to transport the oxygen and carbon dioxide, so you're taking oxygen from the lungs out to the organs, the CO2, which is a waste product, from the organs back to the lungs. Well, that requires a circulatory system. Okay, so you can see they kind of cross paths. They're working together for external respiration. Okay, because lungs and the heart and vessels are working together. So you're breathing the air into your oxygen into your lungs. The cardiovascular system is picking that up into the blood. Okay, so you see how those two work together for external respiration. For internal respiration, this is where the CO2 is going to come out of the organs into the capillary beds and back into the blood. The oxygen is going to go from the blood out into the organ, okay, into the out of the capillary into the tissues. So this is exchange between the blood and the tissues. So this is exchange between the lungs and the blood, and this is exchange between the blood and the tissues. And it's inside. There's no contact with the outside world, so it's internal respiration. Okay? So pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, moving air in and out. External respiration, bringing oxygen in, sending CO2 out. Transport, carrying those gases through the body, oxygen to the organs, CO2 back to the lungs. And internal respiration, again, taking the oxygen out of the blood into the organs, bringing the CO2 out of the organs into the blood. Okay, that should be a lot of review from when we talked about blood flow. So again, two systems are required to do that. So make sure you know which of those four steps is in need of the respiratory system, which the circulatory system, and which uses both. Okay. So when you think about the respiratory system, it's going to include, again, the nasal cavity and the mouth to some extent, because, again, you're mouth breathing for some of you. And the air is going to go down to the back of the throat, which we call the pharynx. Okay, so it comes into the nose, through the nasal cavity, into the pharynx. Remember, the pharynx is that kind of open area behind the nose and mouth. The air then travels to the trachea, and it goes to the larynx, which is like where your Adam's apple is. So remember that esophagus is behind the trachea. Okay, so the air goes into the trachea, not the esophagus, because food and water go down the esophagus. Then the air goes down the larynx into a tube called the trachea, and the trachea will then divide into what are called a right and left bronchus, and then those bronchi will then divide to bronchioles, so become smaller and smaller and smaller, and kind of make a tree, and so that the air can get all the way down into the lungs for gas exchange. It also requires a muscle, the diaphragm. All right, so this is your main breathing muscle. And there's more muscles involved in breathing besides the diaphragm, but it's kind of the main one. Now, big difference between the respiratory zone and the conducting zone. What did I say respiration was? It's not really breathing, right? It's gas exchange. So the respiratory zone is way down at the very terminal end of the bronchioles, where the actual respiratory membrane is, where actual gas exchange is occurring. In the conducting zone, that's just how you're conducting or moving air in and out of the body. So no exchange, no gas exchange occurs in the nose, nothing occurs in the larynx or the trachea or in the bronchus. You've got to get that air all the way down to the very end of the bronchial tree, down to the very tips of this of the respiratory tree in order for you to get actual respiration going on. So all of that is just conducting. It just carries the air into and out of the body. So it's really kind of like dead space. Nothing really goes on there. It's just moving the air. All right, so let's talk about each part of the respiratory system. Okay, the nose, and its function is basically to provide a pathway, okay, so the air can come in. If you think about the nose, it's moist and wet. That allows the air to become warm and moist. So that also allows, doesn't hurt your lungs as much, and also allows it to not dry out your respiratory membranes. So it's been moistened first before it gets there. It filters and cleans it. There's some mucus, so you got hairs in your nose, so that helps catch things before it goes down into your lungs. Because of the space, when you talk, the way you talk and the way you sound is dependent on your resonance chambers, kind of your bone structure and the spaces inside your head. It's where your smell receptors are, your olfactory receptors, and it has those nasal conchae that provide turbulence, those things that help swirl the air. So you should have learned that in 201. I'll show you what those look like in just a second. So your respiratory mucosa, there's mucus all lining the nasal cavity. It's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So what does that mean? Fake layered. Looks like it's got several layers, but it's really just one layer where the nuclei don't line up, so it's kind of fake layered, and it's got little cilia on the apical side. Yeah, that's coming back from 201, I know. That's a long time ago since you guys studied that, but you got to remember it. You've got mucus solutions. They have things that help with your immune system, like lysozymes and defensins, which help fight off infection. Again, that cilia are going to help move things. So when dust and particles are caught in the mucus, that helps sweep it to the throat. You just swallow it down. It goes to your digestive system and it's taken care of. Again, your air is going to be warmed as it's brought in. And also there's some nerve endings, not only for smell, but there's some for sneezing. So if something kind of gets in your nose, you need to get it out. It'll make you sneeze. So this is what it looks like. So here again is your nasal cavity. So this whole area is your nasal cavity. You've got those nasal conchae, which are those kind of ridges. And they're covering those turbinate bones, if you remember your turbinate bones back from your first anatomy. And then the spaces between these conchae are little holes or pathways or channels that we call a meatus. So these are going to be your nasal meatuses. You have a superior, a middle, and an inferior. So air is going to come in and be swirled, and have a chance to be in contact with the hairs and the mucus, and it'll be cleaned and moistened before it goes down into your lungs. So you don't have cold, dry, dirty air going into your lungs. The nose is going to try to fix that. That's one reason you don't really want to mouth breathe, because you don't really get that same effect if you mouth breathe versus nose breathe. Also, for the olfactory sensors to work, the odorants, which are chemicals, need to be moist. They need to be able to be dissolved in water, basically. And so by swirling that allows the odorants to be dissolved, and then the olfactory nerves that are coming down through the cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone can then be bound by those olfactants, and you can smell it. So just a reminder of your pharynx. It's divided into 3 regions. You have your nasopharynx, you have your oropharynx, and your laryngopharynx. Okay, so nasopharynx is that area behind the nose, oropharynx, back of your throat, and the laryngopharynx is down that opening behind your larynx. Okay, so this is your larynx. It includes your epiglottis, which is a flap which covers your trachea so that food goes down the esophagus and not down into the trachea. You have your vocal cords. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Then you have your trachea. Again, we'll go through a lot of this on the actual anatomy lab as well. All right, just for completeness, again, air can come into the mouth, and it would pass through this passage here above the tongue, under the hard and soft palate. Your tongue is needed for speech. We're going to talk about speech, and we're also going to think about resonance. So the spaces inside of your oral pharynx and the position of your tongue also play a role in being able to talk. Okay, so speaking is a function of respiration and breathing. So when you're breathing in and out, you can't talk if you're not breathing. All right. So what is the larynx? That's your voice box. So this is where your voice is, your vocal ligaments, and they're attached between 2 cartilages. We're not going to go into the detail of there's a lot of cartilages and muscles and ligaments in that area. If you're going to be a speech pathologist or even a singer, you probably need to know all that. My daughter is an opera singer, and she can tell you everything you never wanted to know about the larynx. All right. It has elastic fibers, so it's stretchy. And this is, again, where your vocal cords are, and they're also called vocal folds. Vocal cords are going to kind of bump together, and that's part of the making of the sound. When they're open, there's a space there, and that is called the glottis. So the epiglottis, that flap, is right here, is above the glottis. So the glottis isn't really a thing, it's just a space. Okay. All right, so when air comes up from your lungs, as the air is being expelled, that's going to cause those vocal folds to vibrate, and that's how you get sound. All right, we'll do a little more about that in just a minute. So just a brief anatomy of the larynx. So here's your epiglottis, so air is going to come in this way, and you're going to see your vocal, your folds, called your vocal fold here. This is your true vocal fold. And then just superior, just above it, there's something called the false vocal cord, or a vestibular fold. So you have the vestibular fold and the actual vocal fold. So this is your true vocal cord right here. And you can see that when you're looking down inside the larynx. You've got several cartilages. We're not going to talk about very many of them, but you do have a really large one called the cricoid, which is kind of a landmark. It's kind of what you feel. Thyroid cartilage, sorry, this is what I'm talking about. This is the front. So your thyroid cartilage, when you kind of feel your Adam's apple, you kind of feel that. And then the cricoid cartilage is a large cartilage that you can see on the models. It kind of goes around, kind of large on the back. These are landmarks when you're looking at images, and also, again, when you're palpating things, you can also feel some of these cartilages as well. You have tracheal cartilages, and you can sometimes feel those. These are the rings that make up the trachea, and they help keep the airway patent or open, so that way your trachea doesn't collapse. It's always open. You have your hyoid bone here, which plays a role in raising and lowering your Adam's apple, so raising and lowering your larynx. kind of moves when you swallow. And of course there's fat everywhere. All right, so this is looking down into the throat, looking down into the larynx. And so here's the base of the tongue. So this will be the front. This is anterior. And you're looking down. And so if you look, you have your epiglottis. It looks kind of like lips a little bit. It's like your top lip. That's your epiglottis. So it will cover the over the trachea so that food will go down the esophagus and not down the trachea. You can see your true vocal folds. Let's follow the arrow, which are these nice pearly white things. So your true vocal cords are your vocal folds, and these are going to open and close, and the space between there is called the glottis. The vestibular folds, or your false vocal cords, are going to be these kind of things right here. Okay, so the white things are your actual vocal cords. They're going to vibrate against each other and make sound. So when you talk, it's expired air. So you talk on the exhale. So you make sound when you exhale. It's kind of hard to talk. It's kind of hard to make sound on the inhale. You have to kind of stop breathing. You can try it, but it's much easier to make sound on the exhale. So as the air is expiring and going out, then the glottis will open and close. Those vocal cords will come together, and that's where you get the sound. To change the pitch is going to be how tight the vocal cords are. So there's some, again, ligaments and muscles in there that can cause the vocal cords to tighten, and the tighter they are, the higher the pitch. To be loud, you got to expel a lot of air. So it's take a deep breath and let more air out. That makes you loud. So big singers take a big breath and then they can belt out a big old sound. Okay. Again, how it sounds, it depends on your resonance chambers, and so all your cavities, your sinus cavities, nasal cavity, oral cavity, your pharynx, all of that changes and makes your sound like you. So if you are a singer, you really have to be careful before you go get a nose job or something like that, or even thinking about getting your tonsils out. Anything that can change the size and space inside of those cavities and inside your nose and mouth can change your sound. So you may have noticed, especially people who've had their adenoids taken out, which is one of your kind of tonsils, you kind of sound kind of funny, like you're all stuffed up if you have adenoid problems, but you take it out and you sound different because it changes the resonance in your voice. Now you need lips and tongues and teeth in order to actually shape sounds. So it's very important, your teeth, your tongue, your soft and hard palate, as you're moving all of these things in your mouth, that's going to actually shape the sound and allow you to say different things. So the air's coming through my nose, it's going down behind my oral pharynx, down into my larynx. It's going to go through my trachea, and it's going to get to my lungs. This is just a really cool picture that I found. It's they basically took a different dye, and if you think about the lungs, they actually have different kind of divisions. And so as you come off the trachea into the left and right bronchus, these are going to divide into smaller bronchioles, and then smaller and smaller and smaller bronchioles. So you can just kind of see it looks like a tree. I just thought it was kind of a cool color. They're huge. The lungs fill up your whole thoracic cavity, except for the mediastinum, because that's where your heart is, and your esophagus and your trachea. So I'll show you a different view, but they really just fill up your chest. They have different surfaces. They have costal, lateral, and posterior surfaces. Not so important for this class, just to know that if you were going to do imaging and things like that, or if you're looking for possibly a pneumonia or a cancer or something like that, we use those same types of terms to define different parts of the lungs. So I just throw that in there in case you've ever thought about directional terms as far as lungs go. You can use those terms as well. Costal meaning ribs, and then of course anterior meaning front, lateral meaning to the side, and posterior meaning to the back. So here you can see that a little bit better. Here's your trachea. You have your primary bronchus on your left side, right side, and it's going to divide into these smaller bronchus or bronchi. And So the way they do that, or the way they name them, is you could say primary is the first branch. Secondary is when that first branch branches again, so it's the second branch. And then when it branches even again, it's called a tertiary branch. And it continues branching and branching. I want to say I read like 16 times. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to make you identify anything past a secondary bronchus. Okay, that's all you got to know. So you got to know the trachea, the primary bronchus, and then be able to identify a secondary bronchus. If you look at the lungs, on the right side you have 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior. And on the left you have only 2. You have a superior and inferior. And on the left you have that area that's kind of cut out for your heart. It's called the cardiac notch. So you can tell a left and right lung just by looking for this cutout. This is looking down, so you've taken a cut across a transverse section and you're looking down, and you can see here's the mediastinum. So this is where your aorta, vena cava, esophagus, trachea, all that heart is filling up the middle cavity. And then around that you have your lungs, and you can see they really do fill up your chest cavity. Okay, and I've got some things listed, because remember, each lung is in its own pleural cavity. So go back and think about what a parietal pleura means and what a visceral pleural means. You should remember that. Remember your membranes. So I'm not going to tell you. You go back and look it up. What does parietal pleural, what does visceral pleura mean? And what do you think would be, what would you have if you had something called pleurisy? Think about it. All right. So remember those bronchi, they're going to divide until finally they get to the very end. And we call that a terminal bronchiole. And that's going to divide one more time into what's called a respiratory bronchiole that then forms what's called a duct. And so this whole kind of bag of balls is called an alveolar sac. And each one of these small sacs is called an alveoli. Okay? So the tube that goes out to these alveolar sacs are called alveolar ducts. And so the alveoli is where the actual gas exchange occurs. So this is a site of gas exchange. They're very, 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 very thin. They're 1 cell layer thick, so think squamous epithelium. So that allows for gas exchange. So this is the actual respiratory zone. This is where exchange actually occurs out at the end of these respiratory bronchioles. Okay, and you have about 300 million alveoli. You have lots and lots of alveoli, so lots of gas exchange. Going to blow that up even more, kind of go down to that respiratory bronchiole again, and you can see if you cut into that sac, you can see there's just bunches of little spaces, and so that when air comes from the terminal bronchiole to the respiratory bronchiole, it just fills up that whole alveolar sac, and it goes into each one of these little bubbles here, and you can see each bubble is surrounded by capillaries. And so it's so thin that it allows gas exchange to occur really, really easily. All right, so let's put our thinking caps on. Red and blue, we're in the lungs. So red in the lungs is a arteriole or a venule. So you're going to have out to the lungs. That means it just came from the right side of the heart, right? Correct? So you had your pulmonary arteries, pulmonary arterioles, which are blue, okay? Those pulmonary arterioles are going to then form these capillary beds where you have gas exchange, drop off CO2, pick up oxygen. Then the pulmonary venules are going to be the red things that go back to the pulmonary veins and back to the left side of the heart. Okay, so make sure you don't get confused on that. Go back and think about it if you've forgotten blood flow. Make sure you know that the blue ones are deoxygenated, but they're still arterial, and the red ones have oxygen, but they're venous. The actual respiratory membrane is really thin. It's about a half a micron thick, which is really thin. And in these alveoli, they're made up of 1 single layer of squamous epithelium that makes up the actual walls. And there's also some other cells that are scattered within the alveoli. You have some cells that secrete surfactant, and you also have some things that are antimicrobial to help with your immune system. So what is surfactant? It's almost a soap-like substance that's secreted into your body, And because these alveoli are so thin, imagine saran wrap. Okay, just imagine you had saran wrap and you've got it blown up like a balloon. What happens if all the air exits your balloon? That saran wrap, and it does what? And think about it also being kind of moist. It's gonna stick together, right? It's gonna be really hard. So try to breathe in. It wouldn't pop open very easily. Surfactant keeps the alveoli from collapsing and sticking to each other, so they don't collapse and stick to each other. So surfactant makes it easier for those alveoli to kind of remain open and makes breathing really, really easy. I think I'll talk about this later, but it's on my mind, so I'll say it now. If you have a premature infant, one of the things that they don't have yet is surfactant, and so it's really hard for them to breathe because their little alveoli, they stick together every time they exhale. Then they have to inhale and have to pop those alveoli open every time. So that's why you see those little babies that really labored breathing. So what they do is they give them surfactant to try to help that, so they don't have to overcome the surface tension that's causing those alveoli to stick together. Okay, so surfactant reduces the surface tension and allows the alveoli to remain open. So this is what it looks like. You're looking into the alveolar sac. Each one of these is an alveolus. You can see there's actually pores between the different alveoli, so air can easily move all the way through the whole alveolar sac. You can see the capillaries, the blood vessels. You can see that there are some macrophages. Remember, those are immune cells. They're kind of sweeping around in there because some things do get through. You may actually breathe in something, dirt, whatever, bacteria, viruses. So those alveoli are there to try to clean up and protect you from getting sick and getting dust and stuff like that out of there as well. What else can you see on this? Oh, and then you can also see the cells that make the surfactant. These are the little green things. You can see it's just really, really thin. The blood vessel capillaries are right up next to the alveolar wall. Really thin membrane allows easy exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so that was the introduction. Kind of long for an introduction. I usually don't do something that long, but I had a lot to say. All right, so I'll see you next time.